Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Indic Diaries. Our guest today is Dr. Tripurdaman Singh, a distinguished historian, author, and scholar whose work sheds light on some of the most pivotal moments in Indian history. His book, 16 Stormy Days, the story of the First Amendment to the Constitution of India, explores one of the most crucial yet often overlooked episodes in India's post independence journey, the dramatic fight over the First Amendment in 1951. This single piece of legislation, debated fiercely over 16 days, had far reaching consequences for free speech, property rights, and the scope of government power in India. So tune in and enjoy. So, thank you for coming on the show.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for
Yeah.
inviting me.
Yeah. Sir, I wanted to start with if you could just give us a brief about the book and about the first constitution of the first amendment to the Indian Constitution. It would be great for our viewers.
Well, as the kind of title says, the book
Yeah.
tries to take you through like the long narrative arc of what the First Amendment represents. It happened in 1951, less than just over a year after the Constitution had been inaugurated. It introduced some very wide-ranging and quite serious changes to the original constitutional text. These are very important to understanding, especially the question of civil liberties and the nature of freedom of speech in India. They've had, very long drawn out consequences. And the entire story of the First Amendment, in a sense, is, I think, quite an important metaphor for the kind of larger story of Indian democracy, and it challenges many of the shibboleths that we have come to grow up with, in the sense the nature, the kind of default nature of Indian democracy, the very early years of democratic India's history, the role of Prime Minister Nehru, the dichotomy really between people like Mukherjee and what's termed the Hindu right on one side, and Nehru on the other. So all in all, it's in a sense it really exposes or shines a spotlight on many of the contradictions that are inherent in India's transition to democracy from its status as a colony. And so that's basically what I've tried to capture, like all of the elements that I've tried to capture in the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah. Perfect. So, sir, I actually, for preparing for this podcast, I went down to my, CBSE textbooks and stuff like that, and I could not find any mention of the First Amendment. So, do you think it should be taught to like 11th, 12th class students, or do you think it should be just restricted to, law students?
No, because this isn't merely a question of the law. It is also a question of the normative foundations of India, very much a question also of India's political culture.
Okay.
So, yes, given that the Constitution is taught to students, given that the birth of the Constitution is such a celebrated subject, it's important to also, in a sense, give them the whole story rather than just one element of the story. This constitutional change came before India had its first general election. And
Yes.
so it's very much a part in some senses of the birth of the republic itself. In one sense, it can really be, thought of as like the epilogue of the constitutional exercise, and equally as like the prologue of what came after. So it's very important, and I do think it should be taught because it's the what comes after does not make sense if you do not introduce this element into it, right? If you only read the celebratory accounts of the Constitution, then you would think something has gone terribly wrong somewhere, but that something happens very, very early on.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just like to deep dive into the book and the questions that I had. So, sir, in the book, you have mentioned that within the 14 days itself, the first judicial blow was struck, and then it was just a domino effect across the country with judicial blows being struck. So,
Mhm.
the primary question that arises here is that did stalwarts like Ambedkar and Nehru and even Patel, our framers of the constitution, did not see this coming, or did they think that they have an extra constitutional position and would not have to face such blows?
Uh, I mean, there are several things, right? So some things they did not see coming. Some things are, in a sense, when you write a judicial text, how it will be interpreted by someone else is open to question.
Okay.
So they obviously couldn't predict everything. But some things were in itself very predictable. And basically, they were in a position where they were trying to resolve several contradictory impulses. So that is one reason. The second is that they had never really had much experience of working within constitutional bounds or
Okay.
really thinking about the trappings and workings of democracy. So that one of the features that you notice about India's independence struggle is actually there's very little real sort of grunt work being put into thinking about what shape and what form democracy will take
Okay.
in India. And so that definitely is one. The third is exuberance. I mean, they were also caught up in the exuberance of the moment. So it was a moment of very deep. The birth of independent and democratic India was, a moment of great hope, a great moment of great exuberance, and it was very easy to get caught up in that kind of euphoria and believe that great things were on the anvil. And so all of these reasons, really come together. It's you can't pinpoint one, but all of them have something to recommend them.
Yeah, and moving on, one thing that I also noticed from the book is that geographically there were different issues being brought up, right? In UP and Bihar, it was the zamindari issue, and in Madras, it was the communal geo issue. So, is it fair to say that there were geographical factors involving in the different issues that were coming up across the country, or was it just, like, was the zamindari issue also as big in Madras and vice versa, or was there a geographical element there?
No, so zamindari was an issue everywhere. The It wasn't just geographical issue. The geographical issue came by virtue of the states having framing different laws. And if you see, the only law that is struck down by the courts is Bihar, and that's struck down for a very particular reason,
Yes.
which is that they offer quite differential rates of compensation. So someone who has, X amount of land is offered compensation at a particular rate. Someone who has, 10x is offered compensation at a different rate. So it's
Yeah.
found violative of the right to equality. It's not found violative of the right to property. And so that is an issue that was very peculiar to Bihar. What wasn't peculiar to Bihar was the fact that these laws, quite obviously, and this was only to be expected, were challenged in the courts. The courts were duty bound to accept the suits and to examine their constitutional validity.
Hmm.
And that obviously took some time. It's not a case that could be decided overnight. And that delayed what the Congress Party thought was an essential part of their socioeconomic program. And so that delay was, of course, there for everyone, for almost every province.
Hmm.
The striking down of the law was something peculiar to Bihar. And so, while we while it appears ostensibly that these things were geographically contained, they in effect they also weren't, because
Okay.
similar issues and ditto with the communal general order, because the communal general order opened up the question of caste and community based reservations beyond what had been given to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes.
Hmm.
And that would have been a question for everywhere. So even if at that point, in judicial terms, it came up in Madras,
Hmm.
it was very much a question that was there for consideration all over the country as well.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sir, I'll move on. I wanted to quote from the book so that I don't get it wrong. So my next question, sir, I'm quoting from the book here is his death. We're talking about Sardar Patel here. His death
Mhm.
removed from the scene one man who could thwart Nehru's plan or check his petulant confrontation with the judiciary.
Mhm.
So, do we have confidence enough to suggest that Sardar Patel would have been in what aisle in regarding to the First Amendment? Like, would he have opposed it definitely, or would he have been.
Well, I mean, there's obviously no way of convincingly saying what he would or would not have done. But if we look back at Patel's politics, while Patel was not a particularly great friend of freedom of speech, Patel was also not an anti-constitutionalist. So he was well aware of what the constitution was doing. In a sense, even more so than Nehru, he was kind of aware of the tangles that were being thrown up. So he, in all likelihood, and this is my personal belief, it's not, there's no real answer that can be given.
Mhm.
I don't think Patel would have opposed the amendments to freedom of speech. But on the other hand, when it comes to questions of the right to property, the right and the question of reservations, it is perfectly possible. It's also very plausible that he would have found himself with the opposing viewpoint
Mhm.
because Patel had had a great role. Patel had a lot of support and supporters amongst the zamindars, amongst big business, amongst also, in a sense, what's called the conservative element within the Congress or the Congress right, as it used to be called. So it is quite likely that if he'd lived, that the amendment would have taken a different form.
Okay. Uh, so that's actually a segue to my next question is that the third aspect of the amendment bill, which was nationalization, which maybe got a little less coverage than it should have. And I would assume that Patel would not be in favor of that as well.
Yeah.
Uh, so, when I was growing up, also we heard a lot of license permit Raj, the term being thrown around from the 50s to 90s. So,
Mhm.
is it fair to say that this was the foundation stone of the future license permit Raj that took shape?
Yes, very much so. It provided the constitutional plumbing for a host of legislation in the future. And so while it doesn't qualify as like the birth of the license permit Raj, it very much, if you look backwards, it very much provided the constitutional plumbing on which the kind of later edifice was built. Really, the license permit Raj starts to take shape and take effect with the second plan. When import substitution becomes a thing, when they start running out of foreign exchange, when they double down on the idea of heavy industrialization to the neglect of consumer goods and so on and so forth. And the only way to start, to conserve foreign exchange is to clamp down on imports, to start clamping down on what Indian businesses are able to do, etc. So, but crucially, to take forward the project of nationalization, they needed the constitutional plumbing, and that had been provided mostly by the First Amendment. One of the reasons that nationalization isn't given as much focus, both in my book and in the commentary of the period, was that it was nobody seemed to think that nationalization would actually go that far to the extent where private industry would start being excluded altogether. It was in the early 50s, so just after the birth of the Constitution, while by and large everyone was in favor of socialism, it was again something that was quite nebulous. There was no, real serious uh, plan or idea in the works or in the public domain whereby people could see or could tell which direction this was going to take. And so that's in my eyes, that was always one of the reasons why this aspect was wasn't highlighted as much. If you look at the amendment, even though nationalization was a critical part of it, the immediate concern was with zamindari abolition and reservations, and so they obviously take up a lot more attention in commentary and obviously in the book itself.
Yeah. So when you say that no one would have guessed how far it would have gotten, you include the Congress left here as well, like even Nehru here.
Yeah, I mean the Congress left. The thing is that because the what had been a critical part of the Congress left was the socialists,
Yes.
had already split from the Congress by that point. They were actually really critical in the early years of Nehruvianism of what Nehru was doing. So even with Zamindari abolition, there was constant criticism about the fact that um, compensation was being paid, that this was taking too long. Someone like Jayaprakash Narayan would even make statements to the extent where he said this constitution is not fit for purpose. It should be struck down and a new one drafted in its place. So um, at one level, Nehru was also holding the ultra left at bay. On another, there was still a quite substantial presence of the Congress right. uh, Nehru did not have a complete grip on the Congress organization. Um, so at that point, it would be hard to guess that, hard to really visualize how far things would go.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. Nehru was not only attacked from the right, but he was also attacked from the left with leaders like Jayaprakash Narayan, and yeah, that's very interesting. Uh, yeah. So, sir, I think one of the most fascinating parts of the book was when you mentioned that the courts did not necessarily object to land reforms per se.
Hmm.
They, like we talked about Bihar, they objected to how it was being carried out.
Hmm.
So, so that begs two questions. So, it would be great if you could just brief us about, that section of the book as well. And second would be that knowing that, would the so would the First Amendment become a bit useless in the long term? Because would the land reforms still have taken the same form of the same shape in, like, let's say, coming 5 years, 10 years, with some devil like some changes in the details of how it was being implemented?
Yes, because yes and no. So what happens is that the courts strike it. The Bihar Zamindari Abolition and Land Reform Bill is struck down on the ground of, as I mentioned before, violating the right to equality.
Hmm.
Now, at that point, the government has a choice, and given that the act has been struck down on a particularly narrow ground, and that the principle of Zamindari abolition has been upheld.
Yep.
And the principle is upheld because the Constitution itself, while it was being written, everyone knew that this was a Congress program. So it was written with the idea that Zamindari abolition would be carried out.
Hmm.
And so the way the right to property was drafted enabled Zamindari abolition, and the courts upheld that interpretation. So they were, in effect, not barred from land reform. That was quite clear to everyone. So even when the question of a constitutional amendment came up, there were many, including the president, for example, Rajendra Prasad, who urged the government to start with redrafting the Bihar Act rather than taking a much more serious step of amending the constitution. But
Yep.
for Nehru and arguably for others of his persuasion, the idea was that actually this was a good shortcut because you would, in a sense, cut the Gordian knot in one stroke. You would remove all possibility of legislation. You would take away the subject from the purview of the courts. You would, in one fell swoop, create a provision called the Ninth Schedule, which would, in effect, be a constitutional schedule for unconstitutional laws, by which you would just be able to bypass judicial review altogether. And so for them, it became a way of addressing the whole question entirely rather than just look at the specifics of what had happened in Bihar. Now, whether if the amendment had not happened, would the land reform have proceeded more or less in the same way? For the next 5 to 10 years, probably yes. But later on, what you see is that the land reform laws, start to get more strict. So you have the introduction of land ceiling, etc., etc. And then you also have the introduction in the ninth schedule of a whole host of other legislation. So while on the very specific technicalities and very specific questions, it's unlikely that the path of land reform would have differed greatly. But it affected so many other things that it's again very hard to say. The thing is, path dependence in history is
Yeah.
quite difficult to establish. Like there are some moments which are obvious where you can say, okay, things would have gone very differently if this thing had happened.
Okay.
But in a question like this, it's very hard to say how differently they would have gone.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. So, sir, you mentioned ninth schedule. So that is actually my next question. And uh, so, if you, it would be great if you could just give us a background about the ninth schedule. What would a possible justification at that time would be for it? Why does it still exist? And how is it used by the current dispensation? And do any other countries also have such a constitutional vault?
So the ninth schedule, in effect, was again the First Amendment created it by virtue of amending the right to property. It introduced Article 31B, which created the ninth schedule as a repository for initially just land reform legislation, but over the course of time, something like 280 or 290 odd laws have found space there. And what article what the offending provision said was that notwithstanding anything said in the Constitution, these laws would be deemed to be constitutional, right? So in effect, what they did was they allowed, under the guise of the social revolution, under the guise of um, doing something that is ostensibly good for the country and for the public, it allowed the majority of the day to pass legislation that was effectively unconstitutional. So it allowed them to bypass constitutional provisions altogether, and it prevented the judiciary from, in a sense, judging the uh, constitutionality of that legislation.
Yep.
So in one fell swoop, it did two things. It both emphasized the power of the executive. Two, it allowed it to pass unconstitutional legislation, and three, it removed the power of the judiciary from adjudicating on that question. So it was, in a sense, a very strange setup, and it isn't seen anywhere else. It's actually quite funny. I think there's that quote is there somewhere in the book as well, but one of the Supreme Court Chief Justices, Chief Justice Hidayatullah, once quipped that ours is the only constitution that needs protection against itself,
Yeah.
and so this is quite, in a sense, quite a strange and quite an absurd device. Then obviously the court found ways around it as well over the next few decades, and I write about that in the book. You have the emergence of the basic structure doctrine. You have, the cases like Ayar Coelho, and the judiciary does find eventually some, methods of, in a sense, cracking open the safe of the ninth schedule. But uh, when it's, I mean, there's no getting around the fact that this is a profoundly authoritarian and anti-constitutional measure.
And the current like any dispensation would have no incentive to even scrape it down or something like that, like close the vault maybe.
No, I mean everybody wants to use the tools that they're given, right? So,
Yep.
um, and there are precedents. So, of course, in common law jurisdictions, law proceeds by virtue of precedents. So, once something becomes a precedent, once it becomes accepted, uh, once it kind of gains normative traction, it's very difficult to roll back. Uh, Now the ninth schedule isn't really used that much. It doesn't really serve that kind of purpose anymore right now, um,
Okay.
given the sort of judicial decisions that have come, later on with the with the basic structure doctrine and so on and so forth. Um, so there's less of an incentive to use it now. But
Okay.
back then, it was actually a black box. It did give the government carte blanche to essentially do whatever they want.
Okay. Sir, I actually remembered in the like when you were ending the book, you also mentioned a very ironical situation where Ambedkar was fighting actually after he resigned
Mhm.
from the Congress. He was fighting for the Zamindars
Yeah.
in UP and Bihar against what he had co-authored.
Mhm.
So where do you see Ambedkar fitting in? Like, was he also a pro First Amendment guy or?
Ambedkar is an interesting figure. Firstly, because Ambedkar hasn't really left much writing on the First Amendment at all.
Okay,
So one has to use a lot of conjecture. Now, Ambedkar was at heart first a communitarian. Second, he believed in state power.
okay.
Um, and third, he had a very dim opinion of Indian society and for its capacity to either reform itself or to, function or to kind of function in and I'm using a bit of like loaded term, we can unpack it later, but
Hmm.
function in quote unquote modern terms or modern ways. And obviously the question of social justice is quite close to him. He is, if you see from the sparse kind of meetings of the sort of cabinet meetings,
Hmm.
Ambedkar is very much in favor of the amendment on the question of reservations. He seems quite ambivalent on the question of freedom of speech.
Okay,
I would say was generally, uh, while not ambivalent, not a terribly big supporter of uh, what the amendment was doing to the right to property.
okay.
So he had, I think, quite mixed views. If it had been three different amendments instead of it all being, all coming in one go,
Hmm.
I think we would have seen quite different sides of Ambedkar than we do in the course of this story.
Gotcha.
Now, some would argue that he resigns and he in a few months later, and he becomes quite an acerbic critic of even in his resignation statement, he savages what the government is doing, and he also then, as you mentioned, he appears as a lawyer. He takes up the cause of the zamindars, and in his arguments, actually, he says precisely the opposite of what he of the case he'd made while he was in government. Now, one
Yep.
could take this either as a lawyer simply taking a brief and making the points that he thinks are best suited to making his case, and that would be one. The other would be to just accept that people have contradictory shades to their character. The other is to accept, well, that he was also being opportunistic, and I think there's an element of truth in all of that. It's hard to separate one strand from the other in something like this. What's really telling is the fact that he did do it, and so it takes a certain amount of, in a sense, distance. So either two kind of implications can be drawn. One, that when he was in government, which is the kind of way he spins many of the things that he did in government, that
Hmm.
he was bound by the principle of collective responsibility. He just did as he was told. He at one point, of course, he makes that case vis-a-vis the entire constitution, where he says, I was a hack. I just did as I was told. The constitution should be burnt, etc., etc., which is kind of a famous quote
Okay.
um, on his part. So one could either kind of run with that implication, uh, even when it comes to this, right? That Ambedkar was not really the person in command, which he wasn't. It wasn't in Ambedkar's gift to create and pilot the amendment himself without Nehru's firm backing. But then the other implication is, I think, the one which I personally would give more weight to, which was the fact that he um, had slightly contradictory beliefs and he was being entirely opportunistic. So, when you're in government, you do what you think is best for you at that point, and then when you leave, you realize that that's a tool that could that could well be used against you, and you become an opponent. And that's, I think, uh, a kind of thread that runs through both the whole story and
Okay.
also the kind of contemporary context of talking about these legal tools.
Yeah, Ambedkar the pragmatic, but
But I mean, pragmatism was a big part of Ambedkar's thought. I mean, he'd come across
correct.
John Dewey. He'd been very close to John Dewey in America,
Ye-
and so pragmatism is very much a part of Ambedkar's thought.
Okay. As it is even in Sardar Patel's, decision making.
Yes, I mean Sardar Patel's decision making is more than pragmatic. So Sardar Patel is actually someone who has the weight, uh, has a ha, is someone who carries real political weight.
Okay.
Ambedkar doesn't.
Okay.
Ambedkar is a bit of a political lightweight. He doesn't really count for that much in Nehru's cabinet.
Okay.
He is not a particularly. I mean, he doesn't he can't really win an election. He's not. He even loses even after having made the constitution, left Nehru's government, and had
Mm-hmm.
all of those prominent roles. He loses the election when he fights.
Yeah.
He has no. So in that way, he's very different from Patel. Patel really has a strong grip on the Congress organization. Ambedkar doesn't have a similar political organization behind him. So
Yeah.
they come, regardless of his intellectual abilities and his status, Ambedkar doesn't carry the kind of political weight at that point that Patel does.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I was talking to like one of earlier guests, and he said that pragmatism is something that has not been, uh, I think, researched enough in the
Mhm.
as an ideology in the Indian social, socialist left right we study, but pragmatism as an ideology. We're talking about Sardar Patel there. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's pragmatism, and then there are others like Myron Weiner, the political scientist from Princeton, who
Okay.
studied post-colonial Indian politics, who essentially made the argument that actually the ideological cloaks, most of the ideological moves being made in the Indian context are often driven by like simply by self-interest. And so I
Okay.
don't think one should discount the kind of instrumental nature of politics as well. No politician ultimately wants to do something that will wreck their own political career. And so the instrumental should never be discounted when talking about the sort of ideological makeup.
Yep. But yeah, sir. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. That's all I had, and I'll let you know when I post this video. So it would be
Sure.
great if you could share the video as well on your social media.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much,
very
sir. Bye
much
bye.
for having me. Bye.
Bye bye.